Hi, in this video today I'm sat in this beautiful location near Barmouth in Wales in the UK, and I'm just sat out the back of a lovely cottage. It's absolutely fantastic where I'm staying at the moment. For today's story I've decided to read Mr. Bump as a first story. This is a sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump! Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning, when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. I just had to come inside the cottage. Thought I'd sit by the fireplace because it just started to rain outside. So you can see how Mr. Bump had these little accidents. Mr. Bump had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost or broken or splintered, or chipped or snapped or cracked, or torn or burst or wrenched or crunched or split or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and he couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There, he could think about what sort of job he could do, where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So off he set to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day, when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach when he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had, an absolutely splendid idea. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a large apple orchard in his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, and he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. I always like Mr. Bump. It's one of my favourites with the children when they were growing up. They're a bit older than that now. But next one I want to read is Mr. Happy. Again, this is another favourite of my children. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than hair, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, and there is a country called Happyland. As you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happyland is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happyland. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happyland are happy too. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happyland. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happyland. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round, and down and down, and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked round and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked at the door. "Who's there?" said a voice. A sad, squeaky sort of a voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you indeed?" sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," said Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable. "But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow, red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went, up and round and round, and up and round and up until they came out into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable ever so slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners, and ever so slowly it started to turn up at the corners. And eventually Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh, a big booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well, and both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on. As I say, that's another one of my favourites from when my children were growing up. You're never too old to enjoy the Mr. Men stories. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, those couple of stories. As I say, I'm sat inside now because it's a little bit less drizzly than outside. But I hope you enjoyed these stories. Thanks for joining me.